Audio testing, 1, 2, 3. Lights on, camera rolling, and action.
Welcome to the Scaling Creator Podcast, the one-stop shop that explores problems, solutions, and stories for business-minded creators. I'm Soren Dickens.
And I'm Erickson Dickens.
We'll be talking about everything from self-discovery, storytelling, leadership, marketing, sales, operations, and finance.
If you like a healthy dose of education mixed with a generous dash of insightful entertainment, prepare for your ears to be pleasured.
Oh, yeah.
Make sure to check us out at scalingcreator.com and also join our free Discord community.
Scaling Creator launching in 3, 2, 1.
The following content is not intended for all listeners, but we strongly encourage all listeners to listen regardless.
Today, we're going to be talking about the process behind building a creative agency that you can sell, what things you need to have in place so that you can ultimately exit the business yourself. And we'll be talking about things that he recommends to small creative companies that might have 5 to 10 people working with them that are looking to scale and exit for a high valuation. All right, Jonathan, thanks for hopping on the Scaling Creator Podcast. We're looking forward to this episode because what we talk about here in our podcast is going from a solo creator to building a business bigger than just an individual or like a sole proprietor concept. Tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do, and we'll get into it.
Yeah, Jonathan Baker. I am one half of Punctuation, which is a small consultancy that works exclusively with small to mid-sized marketing services firms, helping them grow and scale. But my expertise in particular is on the mergers and acquisition side. So I help small agencies, once they get to a certain point, either find a buyer or find a seller and just make connections.
As like a solo creator, which consists mostly, that's most of our audience, what are some of the things that you would be doing if you're a solo creator doing, $100K to $250K on your own, and you do have the vision to get on top of your business and one day sell it? What are some of the things that you'd recommend to someone in that position who does want to one day work with you in your company?
The biggest single thing to have a sellable business beyond profitability would be less reliance on the founder or the creator. And so you need to, over time, start to build up around you, with process, with people, an ecosystem that can survive without you. Because if you do sell, right, you're going to be gone one day. So there needs to be a way for that business to move on.
And in the process of working with a company like yours, I know you guys do a pretty thorough due diligence process. I was looking at your website. In that process, what are you looking for in particular with a small agency? Are you looking for projected revenue, long-term contracts, robust sales pipeline? What are some of those things that a creator could be, getting into place if they are looking to get in a position to sell?
Yeah, so I would say first and foremost, your positioning. Being tightly positioned is definitely going to do you some favors when you're looking to sell. If you think about who the buyers are of a lot of these types of, smaller agencies, it's larger agencies, and they want to buy something they don't have. So they're not looking for someone who can do everything. They're looking for someone who has a really narrow focus, whether that's in a certain vertical or whether that's, a certain horizontal niche. Beyond that, business development processes, having kind of a proven way to get leads into the door would be important. A lot of these folks are looking for something that they think they can scale quickly. And if there are processes in place and the only barriers are, people or money, then that's something that they can find attractive. Another thing that will serve you well is making sure that you don't have one guerrilla client, making sure that you are kind of diversifying your risk across a broader pool of clients. I mean, that risk gets translated to a buyer. And so they're going to give you kind of less money up front, the more risk they see in buying your business. Beyond that, any proprietary IP you can develop, any type of recurring revenue streams you can come up with, and then obviously focusing on profitability.
In the case that you mentioned, a guerrilla client, I know that's really common for individual, I would say like the freelance creator who might have an agency, or it's a small agency, but they're more of a freelance with support. Oftentimes they will have that guerrilla client. And I know from our experience, we've had that in the past, and you could have that guerrilla client go through some rough patches in their business, and it crushes your revenue, or that gorilla client takes up a lot of time and you're turning away opportunities. What are some of the risks that come along with that? Why a business or a larger agency wouldn't want to buy you because of having like one gorilla client or relying on one, source of revenue?
I mean, the big one is just you could go out of business, right? Like if you lose one client, that's 70% of your revenues. You have to make drastic cuts quickly just to survive. And so, it's kind of one of those classic scenarios of having your eggs in multiple baskets. And, I will say there are pros to having a large client, and that usually you can service that client a little bit more efficiently, particularly on the, account management and project management side of things. But in general, there's just a lot of risk that's, one bad thing happens and it can change the trajectory of your firm. And that's not to say that you should be turning away work from that client, right? Like that's a hard thing to to do. But you really do need to make sure you're carving out some time to try to find a new client and then a second new client to try to kind of cut into that percentage of business over time. So it's something that you really solve for slowly over time.
That's a really good point. Would you say that there's a good strategy for a creator who might have a gorilla client in terms of using that client as a case study and, positioning the success with that client to find other clients similar to that gorilla client that you might have? Do you have any thoughts on how that would work?
I think that's the first place you look in terms of your positioning, right? Like what are you doing really well for that client and how would that translate to other folks? Is it something that you're doing that would, now you have an expertise in healthcare, for example. Now you have an expertise in startup tech and you kind of leverage that moving forward. Another thing you could actually look at is eventually building to sell to the gorilla client if you just don't think you'll be able to get away from them or build up around them. There are instances where these clients don't want to, build up an in-house capability themselves. And if you can do it, then they'll snap you up.
Has there been a case that you've worked on that you've seen that happen within the small agency space where the agency sold to a gorilla client?
Yeah, it's rare, but it does happen.
Is that because the gorilla client wants to bring more stuff in-house, or what's the gorilla client going through in their growth phase that makes them say, hey, you know what, we want to buy up this agency, or at least they're shopping agencies?
Right. I mean, usually it's not even like a growth phase so much as a cost reduction phase. So if they see that they could cut 30% off of their, marketing costs by just snapping up the agency for a, not a big amount of money to them, that's a business decision that some will make.
Okay. So in this case, if the creator is working for a large gorilla client and they might be a small team of 3, a creator with some support, do you ever think it's worth selling yourself to that agency or the larger agency as almost like a full-time, I don't want to say W-2 in this case, how do you navigate that if you are small and the agency, your gorilla client, has so much sway over you?
Yeah, look, I mean, it depends a lot on your long-term personal goals. And I would say you're probably going to want to be a certain size to where what they're buying is not you. Like it can't just be you. But if you are getting tired of being an entrepreneur and want a little bit more stability, sure, that could be a great fit. But I know plenty of entrepreneurs that would hate that. And so you don't want to put yourself in a position where, you're basically just trading what you've built for a full-time job. We look at it on an individual to individual basis, and it's really less about kind of the financial impact in some ways, and it's more about, the long-term lifestyle impact.
Sure, that makes sense. I think there are some creators specifically going into the creating world and they want that entrepreneurial life. And we see that a lot in our community. And then they ultimately decide that it isn't for them and they would like consistency. So I get what you're saying, though. I feel like there's always going to be those cases.
There's plenty of stuff that you learn pretty quick as you grow a business that you're like, oh, I did not know I would need to be doing this, like now I have to learn how to do payroll.
Right. So tell us a little bit about your background in developing businesses. I know that you studied at Emory, you were in the brewing business and you grew a business in the brewery business, which is really difficult for anyone listening that knows anything about beverage companies. That's really difficult. So could you talk a little bit about your past and how you got into what you're currently doing now?
Yeah, sure. So I started in marketing strategy consulting, working with CPG brands. I left that in 2011 to start a craft brewery here in Atlanta with 2 business partners. Grew that. That's actually still going on, up to 6 locations and about 170 employees now. But my 2 business partners are running the day-to-day. I realized the bigger we got, the less fun I was actually having. And so I found kind of an opportunity to put myself in a smaller setting, working with other business owners, and I took it. So we, as business owners, went through the M&A process, and that is what ultimately piqued my interest. So I joined Punctuation, which is my father. It's just me and my dad, basically. Did that 4 years ago. So I've been doing M&A ever since.
Now, when you said that as you started to scale the brewing company, you found less interest, were you losing passion, or what was that process? And how would you relate that to someone who is, building a business to scale, who was in it maybe for the passion, and now they realize that they're just managing a bunch of people?
That's exactly what happened to me. I think you need to understand and keep reminding yourself why you started the business, right? And if you started for yourself, it needs to function for you. I think at a certain point, at a certain kind of level of employees, I realized my day was being taken up by meetings and dealing with, employee issues. I was just not enjoying it. And it was, a hard realization that maybe I'm built more for starting businesses and less for kind of scaling them. I think in America, we have this tendency to shoot for growth at all costs, right? Like growth is what you go for. It's just a given. But growth is neither good nor bad when it comes to business. Growth is, if it's what makes you happy as a business owner, yes, it's good. If it's what scares you and makes you feel trapped as a business owner, because the larger you grow, the bigger your overhead is, the bigger your payroll is, you have to keep bringing in business to feed the beast effectively, then don't shoot for growth.
Build it for what makes the most sense for you as the entrepreneur. Yeah. So in terms of the M&A stuff that you're currently working on, I would say that most of our audience is not that familiar with mergers and acquisitions. Now, can you tell us a little bit about, I guess, like the history of mergers and acquisitions in terms of, we as consumers often see these brand buyouts and these mergers and things maybe on like a macro level, but can you talk about just kind of like the spectrum of what mergers and acquisitions are and some of the history behind it and how it kind of fuels capitalism?
Mergers and acquisitions is really just shorthand for like equity transfers of any kind within businesses. It could be buying a partial stake in a business. It could be bringing on kind of a minority partner who might take on the firm full time. This stuff is happening all the time. What's interesting in the industry that we kind of operate in is that it's this self-perpetuating cycle as well. So you've got these small firms that, end up growing. They grow big enough to where they're now attractive enough to sell. Maybe the owner's getting bored or older, so they sell to a larger firm. That larger firm buys up a few of these folks, becomes much larger, and then sells to an even larger firm or a private equity group. Now you've got this big firm and a private equity group, but you've got some disgruntled employees there who want to go do their own thing. And so they leave, start their own little firms, and start the process over. And so it's happening. It's going to keep happening. Most of these transactions, the vast majority are not name brands. They're simply business owners trying to solve for where they are in their life, trying to figure out what their next moves are.
That's a great explanation. Yeah, very helpful. In terms of the cycle that you're referring to where the employees may be unhappy because there was a private equity takeover, what typically drives that like unhappiness for employees when you start throwing all these businesses together? Is it, is it the destruction of culture? Is it, misaligned management? What's that process like, and why do those situations occur?
It can come about for a number of reasons, but I would say that culture tends to be one of the biggest ones. And that culture is often driven by, the stated goals of the owners. So if your owner's now a private equity company and their goals are to grow you and flip you in 3 years, then they're looking at the business in a very different way. And they're focused on growing top line revenue and making sure that, they're not wasting money along the way. They're not necessarily looking at it, as an investment in an individual person or group of people that someone who is a sole owner has more of the license to do. So I think cultural reasons are the reasons we see most often where kind of, it doesn't work out. But I will say there are plenty of instances where things work out great and the employees end up having more options in terms of vertical movement. They have job opportunities. They have now access to more training. Maybe they get to travel more because they're working for a bigger company and maybe, the company they were working at had just kind of reached a ceiling.
It's interesting how that cycle seems to exist so rapidly too. It seems like recently, people are scaling up these agencies and getting out of them really quickly and moving into the next business. Is that something that you're seeing as well?
I think it's always been happening. I think COVID was an interesting time period where you saw a lot of folks kind of either they lost their jobs willingly or unwillingly, but they entered a period of time of kind of soul searching and figuring out what they want to do with their time, their lives. And so we are starting to see some of those agencies now coming into their own, people making decisions like, what is my next move?
What are some of the agencies that maybe you saw transition during COVID? Was there a particular type of marketing agency that specialized in anything? I know there's a lot of tech changes happening and marketing seems to always be evolving. And how does that play into the landscape that you work with?
Back to the importance of kind of positioning your agency, COVID had a really unique effect on the marketing industry because it affected the industries that marketing worked for more. And so, we work with agencies that only work with high-end hotels, for example, and they were just decimated during COVID, right? And so they've spent the next 3 years just trying to build back up to baseline if they're still in business. And then we work with agencies that work with small startup or big tech. And those agencies thrived during COVID because everyone was, working from home and all these tech companies were reaping profits. That has now cooled down, right? So that's kind of a cycle that we're seeing. And so the cycle really is dependent on the industries that the agency itself serves, which is just kind of fascinating.
Looking back, what do you see coming in the next few years? I'm sure there's a handful of agencies right now hammering the election year. What seasonal or trends do you see in the future?
Yeah, so right now we actually see a lot of buyers of agencies and not a ton of sellers. So there's more demand than there is supply in terms of, acquisitions. AI obviously is what everyone is talking about. It's going to affect everyone a little differently. I am not a wizard, so I don't know exactly what that looks like, but I know that content creation in particular is just getting, it's under more of a yellow flag, I would say, and folks are curious to know how AI is going to impact content creation, whether that's video, copywriting, whatever that is, right? And I think, it's sooner in for copywriting than it is for video, but that doesn't mean that it's not going to affect video. There's this idea of SaaS, software as a service, is also starting to perpetuate all aspects of business. And so you're seeing agencies trying to infuse pieces of that SaaS framework into their business. And, the big reason is really so that they can develop some kind of reliable income stream that isn't necessarily so tied to these big market fluctuations.
So you talked about how the cycles of different markets, different industries affect the agencies that service those industries. And I think as a creator and for the creators listening that want to set themselves up for success in the long term, how can creators look forward and say, this industry that I'm going to be stepping into is safe and secure? Unlike the hotels in COVID, we learned in COVID, hospitality got crushed. How can a creator or a small agency position themselves, as you're calling it, to be successful?
5 years ago, I would have told you that go into hospitality and retail because that's a safe industry. It's just mind-boggling to imagine that something like that can go to zero. And yeah, it did, but it's bounced back. I think you need to think about just the human condition and what people will always be consuming. I'm using hospitality as a negative, but in some ways it's really like a positive because people are always going to want to get out of their own houses and hang out with other people in good times and bad. There are reasons for that, right? So you're looking at like kind of recession-proof businesses or industries. You don't necessarily have to pick a super secure industry as long as you are stocking up enough cash to be able to make a pivot if you need to. So I wouldn't say don't target frozen yogurt stands because you think it's a fad, although don't. But just make sure you have enough money in the bank so that if you do start seeing the writing on the wall, you can pivot and target another industry.
Yeah, that's good to know. I definitely don't target frozen yogurt stands, but that's really good advice. So where can people find you and how can people connect with you? This conversation's been great, and I think we'll further this conversation in a more in-depth episode in the future, but where can people connect with you so they might be able to reach out and chat? Yeah,
we actually created a webpage for listeners of Scaling Creator. So if you go to punctuation.com/scaling creator, you get to see my ugly mug and you can contact me, ask questions, schedule time on my calendar, and learn more.
Well, Jonathan, I appreciate you coming on. It's a great chat. You keep it short and concise. I feel like our audience will get a ton of value out of this, considering the phase of where they're at in their journey of building an agency. So thank you so much.
It's been fun. Thanks.